Yes, hello and good morning everybody. My name is Stephanie Beitin. I'm Director of Partnerships in Eco-Business. We are a media platform and we are dedicated on sustainable development and responsible business. And as you just saw, media is a super important tool to show what is really going on in our world today. And we just saw the powerful images of Craig's trailer. I'm very happy to be here to moderate the panel that is called Climate Consciousness, Make Climate Action Count. And before we start off, I would like to shortly introduce our very distinguished speakers. So we have here with us, next to me is Pamela Lee. She is Director of Policy and Planning Division of the National Climate Change Secretariat, Singapore. Yes. Craig Gleason, filmmaker of The Plastics Ocean, and he just launched a new project called The Last Glaciers, based in Hong Kong, and an old friend of Eco-Business. Next we have Sasha Kalb. She is Vice President, Risk and Compliance of American Express Global Business Travel. Welcome. And last but not least, Tareen Fogg. She is Director of Sustainability Services in KPMG Singapore. So this is a fantastic lineup. Please a round of applause for all of them. Yeah, thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much, Chiara, for setting the stage so nicely, and thank you so much for putting this charter together. I think it's a very timely moment, and it's a very important step to have like both the focus on climate but also on gender, and also our managing editor Jessica Chiem. She's a great warrior for the environment but also for gender diversity, so that is great. Just to start off, a few thoughts. Next week there will be the UN Climate Action Summit, which is actually the first time that heads of government and states will come together after committing to the Paris Climate Agreement 4 years ago. And tomorrow we will actually expect to see one of the biggest climate strikes ever, where millions of young people will march on the streets for climate justice. And it's not only young people, it's becoming organizations, unions, companies. Actually, we were thinking of striking as well. I don't know if they would agree. But I think companies and governments, and we, each individual of us, we are urged to respond to the climate crisis. And what can we actually do to accelerate climate action? So that is the big question of our panel today. We have around, 35 minutes, I think. And I would actually like to start with Craig. You have been fighting for the environment, I think, for the longest time being. And your movie, The Plastics Ocean, I don't know, how many of you saw The Plastics Ocean, the entire movie? Can I have a show of hands? Some hands up. So who didn't, please watch that movie. It's really impactful.
Some people have homework, I can see that.
So maybe you can tell us a bit about the story of that movie and your latest project as well.
So Plastic Ocean, actually the co-creators, the producers, both women and good friends of mine, and they came to me and asked me if I knew about single-use plastic, the issue. And this was in 2010. And I'm an oceans guy. I make documentaries on the ocean. I grew up on the beach. I'm a surfer, I'm a diver. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And so they asked me why they were heading off to do some research in the North Pacific Gyre, where this so-called floating island of plastic is, to take a look while I was surfing and working in the ocean. And the thing about plastic is that once you start seeing it, you start seeing it everywhere. And so I had my own awareness, and I started seeing it on the beach, tiny coloured pieces of plastic in the wind line and in the seaweed, and then plastic bags floating around my legs while I was surfing, and then wrapped around the reefs that I was diving on. And I started to question myself, why hadn't I seen this before? And I realised that plastic has become such a part of my life that it was in fact invisible to me. Because it is a fantastic product. It's allowed us to move food around the world, to keep food fresh, to be able to see products on the shelf before we buy them for medical purposes. So it has been this wonderful product, but it's also the most durable product we have ever made. So how could we ever have marketed it as being disposable? But we did that, and we all bought into this lie that this durable product is disposable. So Once I started to realize that this wasn't the case, and we started looking for science around the globe to see how bad the problem was, we couldn't find anything on it. So we decided to go and look ourselves and to take teams of scientists with us and to investigate the problem. And as we began the investigation, which initially started in the ocean, we found that we were just requiring more answers because we had more questions. So we expanded the scope. It became a land-based documentary and then a human health-based documentary as we realized the extent that this is affecting human health.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about your latest project, the Last Glaciers? It was a sneak peek yesterday here in Singapore, I heard.
Yeah, so the latest project is called The Last Glaciers, and it's related to the issue of plastic. 6% of oil reserves go into making plastic, and of course that creates problems with climate gases, gases that affect the climate. But once again, for me, that project started 4 years ago as an awareness. I happened to meet a scientist who was giving a talk at a BNP Paribas seminar that I was at, and he explained climate change in a way that I could understand for the very first time, very simply. And up until that point, to me, the science had been extremely dense and difficult to understand. And there were many different scientific reports on how climate change was coming about and what was affecting it. But he was an ice core scientist, and they take ice cores from glaciers that are as old as 100,000 years to 800,000 years to present day. And they're able to measure the gases, which show what the atmosphere was like 800,000 years ago, all the way up to present day. And what it shows is this natural oscillation of gases changing in the atmosphere as the climate gradually and naturally changed as the Earth spun around the sun up until 120 years ago. And then suddenly this hockey stick happens, which literally goes off their graph. And we start to see quadruple the amount of methane, double CO2, water vapor increase because of heating oceans. And so that, coupled with a trip that I was taken on by the producer of the film, who's an extreme sports person, into the mountains where it should have been white at that time of year, and it wasn't, it was brown. And so I went back to the ice core scientists and asked them to explain to me how long this process had been going on. And when they started to reveal the data to me, I realized we had a story to tell, and that I could bring the same awareness that I'd just experienced through to a general audience.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I feel like plastic is such an important topic, but it's also taking the awareness of some other pressing challenges like climate change. So we come back to that. I want to stick one last question with you before I go over. The Climate Action Summit last year already had like super important commitments from government and businesses, but still the iPhone XS got like 370 times more media coverage. What do you expect from next week? Will there be a growing awareness of the issue? What do you think?
We're already seeing a growing awareness, and I honestly believe that sometimes the discussion is overshadowed by what's happening in the United States. And I travel and talk at conferences and to school kids and all sorts of people all around the world. And what I'm finding, particularly as I learn more about the finance industry's role and other industries' role in solutions, is that there is a lot being done. That we're seeing $250 billion being invested right now by large companies in renewable energy. By 2050, 80% of the Earth's energy will be produced by renewables, 40% of that solar. So I mentioned at a seminar this morning, the train has left the station. We no longer have to herd people and get them onto the train to get them to understand climate change. We already have that. What we're seeing older politicians, generally white males, legacy supporters of legacy industries that are holding on to an industry and a time that they understand, but that's a generational gap. And what we're seeing today are young people, young entrepreneurs who are keen and hungry to bring their experience, their technology into the fore and to start to help us move on climate change. So at the summit that I'll be attending in New York in 2 days' time, what I'm hoping to see is that we we change the language. I want to see a change from from the terminology of climate change to climate crisis.
Yeah, it sounds too nice, right? Climate change is like, oh, it's changing. We actually in eco-business changed it to climate crisis, just to underline the urgency, and I hope the same. So you touched already on the business side, so I want to go on business. I want to actually ask the audience another question. So do you feel that in your organization there is a growing awareness, or let's put it the other way, do you feel that the climate crisis is posing a substantial risk to your organization? If so, can you please raise your hands? Anybody feels that the climate crisis is posing a risk to your organization? Not so many. I asked the same question yesterday. They were all hands up. Terina, you're in touch with many companies. You consult companies. So do you think companies are realizing that this is not a nice-to-have CSR issue, but a real business problem?
Yes, I think that realization is coming through very quickly right now. Just last month or maybe 2 months back, KPMG published our annual CEO Outlook survey. And in that survey, what we traditionally do would be to ask about 1,300 CEOs globally on what is keeping them up at night, right? So the typical questions around what are the key business issues, the challenges that you're dealing with right now, what are you really worried about? And we were caught by surprise because the results were astonishing. Climate change came up tops in the list. It's the entire list of the top 10 risks that CEOs find challenging and that you need to deal with on an urgent basis. Climate change was top. And that came as a surprise because climate change was ranked 4th place last year. And everything else was centered around technology, things like cyber risk, artificial intelligence, all the big words that we hear about day in, day out in the business world. Those have taken a 2nd place or 3rd place in relation to climate change. So I brought this back and I was concerned because I said, look, if I look at the Asian context, there is a lot of talk around climate change. But when I talk to individual clients in the corporate world, not so many of them know what this is about. So there is an entire question of having to demystify climate change. There is another more important question around, after demystification, how do I then make business decisions around it? And what kind of solutions do I have around climate change? And I realized that we had some internal results around that survey for Asian companies, and there were regional results. Instead of climate change being top place, it was ranked 5th. And to me, that was a huge red flag. Why? Because for a country, for example, like Singapore, or maybe a lot of our Southeast Asian neighbors, we are actually just very dependent on the global economy. And us ranking climate change as 5th place, when globally it is 1st, means that we are blindsided. It is a huge blind spot that we are not plugged into that global community in terms of awareness or being able to respond to some of these things or being adaptable, right? So this gap between the 1st place and the 5th place, it is a huge cause for concern. And to me, for consultants, it is something that we do have to highlight to a lot of our corporates to say, look, you guys, being part of your whatever business you are in, whether it is your supply chain, whether it is the business community, your financing vehicles, what are you missing out on? Are you really looking at your business? Are you really addressing what is critical right now? So that was a huge wake-up call for myself personally and for a lot of colleagues in KPMG.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that's a really important point, and I hope you can also help drive this awareness, to change the awareness. Sasha, you look after business travel, which is obviously a tricky one because, we have to travel. Every one of us came here somehow, and we don't have the time to take a carbon neutral sailing boat like Greta Thunberg is doing to go to New York. We have to travel, but how can you incorporate some of climate friendly measures in your operations?
Yeah. So let me explain who we are and why we're important to this discussion. Most of you know the brand American Express. I work for a company called American Express Global Business Travel. It's a joint venture owned in part by American Express, and we are the world's largest partner for managed business travel. We put a lot of people on planes, we put a lot of people in hotels, and we are right at the forefront of an industry that frankly is responsible for a lot of carbon dioxide generation and waste generation. So what do we do? What do we do with this responsibility as the world's largest travel management company? How do we address the growing concern about climate change? Actually, I hadn't heard the term climate crisis, but I will use that going forward. So one of the things we have to do is look internally. It's very good for us to develop products and tools, and I will speak about those. But if internally we aren't managing our own waste generation, then it's very difficult for us to go to preach to our clients and address their concerns. So we commenced something called our Environmental Commons Project. And that's where we really looked at all of our internal office materials. And we found, which was startling, we had a very heavy reliance on single-use plastics, styrofoams, and wax-papered cups. So the first thing we did was to say, company-wide, we're going to phase all of those out. Sometimes it's immediate and we just cut off that supply chain, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we need to phase in reusable cutlery and glasses and cups. Now that sounds like a small step, just changing our office supplies, but we have a lot of offices and employees globally, and we have a lot internally that we can do to manage our internal waste generation. The other thing is externally. So we are paradoxically in the environmental leadership space because we're in such a concerning or difficult environment. It's the travel space. And we're seeing an increase in our clients who really want to understand their environmental footprints better. Just get a map, an understanding of what their carbon footprint is. And so we developed a tool called Green Insights. It actually helps our clients establish a baseline to calculate their carbon footprint, and with that, travel smarter and travel better. Another thing is green meetings. We organize a lot of meetings and events for our clients. So Green Meetings is a tool that really drives our clients towards the more eco-conscious meeting, staying at environmentally friendly venues, using diverse suppliers, reducing meeting waste, as they say, making sure that there aren't
so happy that there are no plastic bottles
on the table. And even small things, changing hearts and minds, like incorporating sustainable initiatives as team building exercises can really help.
Thank you so much. What are some of the challenges that you are facing?
The travel industry. Okay, so the travel industry, as I say, is both uniquely placed to help manage the climate crisis and also a contributor to it. The travel industry globally is a $7 trillion industry. We employ 1 out of every 10 people in the world. Travel is very important. Without travel, we could not have come together to discuss important issues like we're discussing today. Fosters diplomatic missions and creates the ties that bind. That said, the travel industry is one of the largest contributors to carbon dioxide emissions and waste generation globally. It's estimated that the airline industry alone contributes to 2% of all global CO2 emissions. So we have both a huge responsibility and opportunity to help foster this crisis. And airlines and hotels are beginning to see this not just as a social issue, but as a business critical issue. Our travelers are saying, we don't want to stay in a hotel room that has 30 individual plastic bottles for all of my toiletries. And so hotels are accommodating and adjusting. I'm staying across the street, and I noticed immediately that I didn't have those plastic bottles in my room, which resonates very well to our customers.
I ask. I actually, because I travel a lot, I go straight to the manager and when we're booking, and we ask not to have plastic products in our room, and they ask why, and I explain. And I don't need plastic wrapped around my suit when it's pressed. I think if you're a 5-star hotel, putting a plastic bottle in my room looks cheap. Just put some filtered water in a nice jug. It's so easy, and I think that when you encourage businesses down that path, they actually start to see the light themselves.
Yes.
Absolutely, and we're seeing that time and time again, particularly from our younger travelers, saying, which hotel or which carrier can you put me in that will address that needs? Yeah. And then, that drives change because that drives business patterns, right? Yeah. In terms of the airline industry, as I said, it's a huge contributor to carbon dioxide emissions, and we're not really there with biofuels or alternatives yet. But what the airline industry is doing very well is becoming more fuel efficient. So things like employing newer aircraft. Each new generation of aircraft is 15 to 20% more efficient than the previous generations. Fuller plane occupancy. Paradoxically, the low-cost carriers with single-class cabins are more fuel efficient because they have more people aboard. There's a terminology, it's altitude optimization, and sometimes it's called green departures. I'm not sure if I'm in line with that, but that's where aircraft can maximize their departure times and reach the most fuel-efficient stage of flight, which is the cruise, faster. So adopting steeper landing and departure paths are very helpful.
I think I heard, I just heard the sentence this week that actually 2019 is the first year that flying gets unsexy. It's the first time in history that people are, and I do, I'm not going home for Christmas because I'm aware of for a week traveling home and the carbon footprint. So I think people are getting more aware. The industry has to change and they have to look for new ways. It's not easy on the planes. But how do you do? You travel a lot.
Many of the scientists that we've engaged with the last glaciers don't fly. I mean, they won't travel to a conference like this. Instead, they'll request a video link because they're at they're at ground zero with this issue, and they see what happens, and they've become so passionate about it. For us, in order to tell this story, our carbon footprint is enormously high. I mean, we were flying with NASA. We were the first TV crew to be taken by NASA on their ice bridge project to fly over Antarctica to measure the ice, and that was in an old 4-engine DC-8, 1949. This plane, and heavy fuel consumption, but you need it because we're going for 10 hours into the center of Antarctica. If you're in a 2-engine plane and those engines cut out, there's no coming back. So they fly 4 engines for a reason, for safety. But what we're doing is we've engaged the airlines to help us offset our carbon footprint. And when we talk to people about offsetting carbon, the average person thinks it's just accounting trickery. How can you do that? You're burning carbon. How can you get that back? And so we actually show in the film what carbon offsetting means and how it works by, having mangroves planted on foreshores and reforestation and all sorts of things. So it's an important part of the film is telling that message. But we're open. We're very honest about the imprint that we're.
But I think that's the message. At least we can offset our flights and do recover some of the CO2. I would like to turn over to the politics side because I think that's a really important aspect. And Singapore had declared last year for the Year of Climate Action, and this year is the year towards zero waste. And actually this year in the National Day rally, it was the first time that a Prime Minister spoke about climate change, and he actually called it quite dramatically. He called it one of the gravest challenges that human face faces. So I think it is clear that there's an urgency, but what are some of the policies that you're putting in place?
Thank you. Indeed, for a low-lying island state like Singapore, climate crisis really resonates because it's an existential issue for us. Sea levels rise, we get threatened. So it's not something that we can sit about and twiddle our thumbs and think about, let's just wait and see. It's not a wait and see. We do action right now. We put in place policies, regulations. We put in place concrete actions right now. So under the Paris Agreement, we've already put forward a pledge that by 2030 we will reduce our emissions intensity by 36% from 2005 levels, as well as to peak our emissions around 2030. And currently, we are undergoing a public consultation exercise because we're looking ahead beyond 2030. How might we transit to a low-carbon future, and how are we going to steer Singapore, which is faces so many challenges in terms of renewable energy deployment, for example? How might we, even despite all these constraints and challenges, transit to a low-carbon future? And we're looking at possibilities, including, for example, the importation of green hydrogen, for example. Looking at possibilities such as how might we scale up carbon capture technologies so that we can concentrate and sequester carbon and store it or utilize it for other purposes. So in order to decarbonize a country's electricity grid like Singapore, where it's very, very difficult to plaster solar because we're so land constrained, for example. We don't have geothermal, we don't have hydro. we're going to have to look at technology in order to be able to overcome our constraints. I thought I would also like to talk about how we are going to be looking at how we can reduce waste. You talked about plastics. Our plastics are incinerated here. So, but even so, there is still the issue of the emissions that come about because of plastics incineration. And so the challenge is to actually reduce the amount of waste, and plastics waste is one of them. And we've set ourselves the challenge of being able to reduce the amount of waste that we send to the landfill by 30% by 2030. And that is a challenge that every individual is going to have to play a part in. We really have to think a lot harder before we just use and dispose of something. And there's also going to be an extended responsibility for the producers as well, because packaging, for example, plays a very big role in the amount of waste that we generate.
Can I ask you, where do you think could Singapore even be bolder in policy, in regulation? Where could Singapore step up, also like as a leading role here in ASEAN? Where could Singapore be bolder in their decisions?
I think we can be bolder in terms of driving collective action, for example. So, I mean, the challenge that we just set for reducing waste further, I think, is one. I think we can push further as well to increase our recycling rates. We've just announced under our 2040 Land Transport Master Plan that we hope for 9 out of 10 of all journeys that are made during peak hours to be made using either shared or active mobility or public transport. That's a very, very big goal, I think. And as well as to move towards 100% more clean vehicles and fleets as well by 2040. I think we can probably give an added push as well with regard to the electrification of vehicles on the road. So we want to be able to move as many people to public transport, but even amongst those who still have to travel with private vehicles or on taxis, etc., how might we green that further?
Okay. Craig, I would like to ask you to respond. Where do you think like policies, not necessarily only Singapore, but in general, politics can be braver and bolder?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of legislation because, you know, humans are like water. We follow the path of least resistance because we're lazy. And corporations are the same, unregulated. They'll do what they need to because the number one job of a CEO is to return value to shareholders, not to protect people from the human health aspects of the products that they make. So we need legislation, and we show in the film where Germany legislated in 1991 to force manufacturers and resellers of plastic products to be responsible for the product, cradle to cradle responsibility. If you make it, you must be responsible for it to the end of its life. And what happens then is that you start to see design innovation. You start to see alternatives being used. Personally, the only way to solve the single-use plastic crisis, and it is a crisis, particularly when you look at the health implications, the endocrine disruption, the cognitive problems it's causing our kids, we need to ban single-use plastics. It's the only way forward. The earth has been toxified by this product, and I see it all the time. And it's come up the food chain, and guess who's at the top of the food chain? We have become the ultimate filters for this problem. So we need to ban it. We need to declare it toxic so it can be dealt with under existing legislation, regulations with toxic products. And we need to be tough about this. And what we need to do is introduce transitional periods, because we can't expect business to go from full steam ahead to stop. So we need transitions, and circular economies will help with that. Moving towards loop systems, the old milk bottle way of life, where when I grew up, the bottles of milk were delivered on the door. We used the contents inside, put the bottles back, they were taken back, washed, filled again with the product. That's coming back, and it's being trialled in the US and Europe right now with great success. As long as that economy is local, then it works. So I absolutely believe that legislation and regulation is important.
Thank you very much. I want the last round to the two business sides. So the Global Commission of Adaptation, which is led by Bill Gates Foundation, Ban Ki-moon, and the World Bank, they just released a report that investing 1.8 trillion globally in the next 10 years could yield in 7.1 trillion benefits in mainly in adaptation and climate resilience. Is this something that you also try to like push through your organizations and explain to other businesses there is a business case for sustainability?
Yes. Yes. So we do quite a bit of work around that. Normally, what we like to do is to start talking to companies at a more strategic level, because we find that that is the most impactful in terms of changing organizational behavior if we start from the top, right? But the corporate behaviors themselves would be one way of doing it, but increasingly what I've seen in the landscape is it is really very powerful as well to talk to individuals on the ground, because there is so much dynamism that is associated with the topic of sustainability. So just talking to the young people, for example, in an organization, even within KPMG, has huge impacts, you know, and it's very, very powerful. And that creates a sense of momentum and makes sustainability much more of a movement that's powered by motivation or self-motivation rather than a corporate structure that needs to be introduced and pushed. And so that if we are able to kind of combine the two in good measure, then I think we have a very good spot for corporates to then move ahead with a lot of the climate change initiatives that we want to do.
Do you think sustainability is already in the boardrooms? Do they talk about sustainability?
Yes. So sustainability is much talked about. The two things that we need to look at, for example, would be around risk management. And when we talk about risk, it includes strategic risk. And so at the board levels, a lot of the board members look at this as a very holistic, strategic discussion around sustainability, what they need to deal with going forward for the company to be profitable in the long run, because the stakeholders have different expectations now. The workforce has different expectations. It's difficult to want to hire good people and not be a responsible organization. I mean, the discerning talents out there are going to ask a lot of difficult questions, right? They want to know that they are working for a good organization that's aligned with their values as a whole.
Yeah, so we're seeing it more and more, again, coming back to the travel industry. For corporations, when they partner with a preferred carrier or a preferred hotel chain, want to understand what that enterprise is doing in order to reduce their carbon footprint. Some carriers have been very publicly named and shamed, and it is affecting their traveler population. Some carriers have been very public about their efforts for carbon offsetting, fuel maximization, putting resources into research for biofuels. We're not there yet in the airline industry, but hopefully we will be. So that's very, very much a business impact on us. And as I say, hotel chains, the primary issue is, will I have plastics in my hotel room? Will I have the option to have my sheets and towels laundered every third day versus, you know, just as a matter of course, taking them out of the room and wasting soap and water to wash them? So yes, very much so.
Great. To finish up, I would like just to ask a last round of like your advice for a call of like action or a commitment, either personally or for your organization, that you could think of that everybody can take away and do as well. Would you like to start?
Personally?
Personally or like either way.
I made my husband sell the car after I joined the sustainability space, and I take public transport to work every day.
Yeah.
I urge people to watch my films. Storytelling is very powerful, and awareness is key. As I say at the end of A Plastic Ocean, with knowing comes caring, and with caring comes change. You can't care if you don't know. So it's sharing the awareness, getting people to watch the films, educating children about the problem, but more than that, educating the adults, because what we've found with our films is that the kids watch the films, get involved, and then they educate their parents. Because no parent wants to be a villain to their child. They want to be a hero. So they listen, and many children have been the have caused audits on single-use plastic in people's homes, and I get parents telling me that every day. So for me, it's storytelling and creating awareness.
Yeah, so I'd like to continue our environmental commons project where we really analyze what office materials we use in all of our multitude of offices globally and carry that home. So I've done something very similar to my husband in terms of making sure that we audit our own household and reduce plastics. And in fact, even my 4-year-old is asking about why we're using certain products because she's learning at school that we shouldn't.
Yeah, just practicing what I preach is a huge challenge for me already. On a daily basis, it is very difficult because there are comfortable habits that we all like to fall back on. But I think it's important to be very aware of the examples that we set for our own children, and also in the workplace where, you know, if I'm talking about sustainability and I'm buying salads for lunch in plastic containers, I get a lot of flack from my own team, right? And some of these things, it causes embarrassment on a personal level, but it also causes a lot more reflection.
Yeah, and with that, I would like to end. We saved 2 minutes, so it's even better. Our commitment in eco-business is to continue our work of advocating sustainability. Please sign up to our please sign up to our newsletter, stay engaged, and please sign the charter for the commitment. And yeah, have a wonderful remaining event, and thank you very much to all of our speakers.